pull out your knitting project. This episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Every week on Hired, they run an auction where over 1,000 tech companies in San Francisco, New York, and LA bid on Ruby developers, providing them with salary and equity up front. The average Ruby developer gets an average of 5 to 15 introductory offers and an average salary offer of $130,000 a year. Users can either accept an offer and go right into interviewing with the company or deny them without any continuing obligations. It's totally free for users, and when you're hired, they give you a $1,000 bonus as a thank you for using them. But if you use the Ruby Rogues link, you'll get a $2,000 bonus instead. Finally, if you're not looking for a job but know someone who is, you can refer them to Hired and get a $1,337 bonus if they accept a job. Go sign up at hired.com/RubyRogues. I'm excited to tell you about a new sponsor of the show, Rollbar. One of the frustrating things about being a developer is dealing with errors. Relying on users to report errors, digging through log files to debug issues, or a million alerts flooding your inbox ruining your day. With Rollbar's full-stack error monitoring, you get the context, insights, and control you need to find and fix bugs faster. It's easy to install. You can start tracking production errors and deployments in 8 minutes or less, or automatically create new issues in GitHub, Jira, Pivotal Tracker, etc. We have a special offer for Ruby Rogues listeners. Go to rollbar.com/RubyRogues, sign up, and get the Bootstrap plan free for 90 days. That's 300,000 errors tracked free. Give Rollbar a try today. Go to rollbar.com/RubyRogues. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 268 of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel we have Sam Livingston Gray.
Hello from Cape Cod.
Coraline Ada Emke.
Hi from Chicago.
Jessica Kerr.
Good morning.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Quick reminder to go check out, I've got Angular Remote Conf and React Remote Conf coming up. But we also have a special guest this week, and that's Jameis Buck.
Hello.
Now, Jameis, you've been on the show before, I think. Do you want to introduce yourself again real quick, though?
Sure, be happy to. I'm Jameis Buck. I write software, unlike most of the people listening to this, I'm sure. And I enjoy mazes and recreational programming, and I'm currently living in sunny Smithfield, Utah, while my wife goes back to school.
Smithfield, that's up by Ogden, isn't it?
It is. It's north. It's closer to Logan.
Oh, okay. Oh, the Utah connection. Strikes again. Awesome. So the first time I heard of Jameis, I was actually working at BYU, and somebody talked to me about Ruby, and then somebody else, when I mentioned it to them, talked to me about Jameis. So then things moved on. I joined the Utah Ruby Users Group, and it turns out that Jameis was one of the people that started that. So
that's right. That was a long time ago. Ancient history.
Yeah. And then there have been other connections over the years at conferences and things. But I'm super excited. I love talking to Jameis. Always doing interesting things. And this week we're going to talk to you about mazes.
Yeah, let's do it. Mazes are awesome. I've been having kind of a love affair with mazes for, I don't know, like 20 years. So there's high school, and then, of course, I had the obligatory fascination with Dungeons & Dragons, and I wrote several random generators for the 3.5 edition of Dungeons & Dragons, including a random dungeon generator, where I dusted off my maze skills for that. And I've been playing with them various different times and places, and it's just been a lot of fun. Like, there's so many different ways to vary them and to experiment with them, and it's just like this bottomless rabbit hole. I was going to say pit, but that's not very pleasant. It's a lot more fun than that.
I remember in my early days of D&D, I've been playing since I was a kid, and mapping was one of my favorite things. I love drawing maps on graph paper, and when I was a player, I loved the task of being the mapper, and that's something that's missing from the 5th edition games now.
Really? I haven't checked the 5th edition. That's disappointing.
Yeah. It's much more like tactical maps, and you don't really map your surroundings. So I think that was a really cool part of the game that we're losing out on.
I agree. I've always loved the maps, and probably because of the maze connection. But yeah, just what's around the next corner, or what could be around the next corner. I've always loved that.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious. It seems like mazes, I don't know. I guess I don't know enough about them to think that they're all that complicated. You make them so that there's just one way through, right? So
sure. I mean, well, that's the thing. There's perfect mazes, which are the one solution through the maze. But then you can play the what if game. What if there were multiple solutions through a maze? You know, how do you take a maze with one solution and complicate it so that there's more than one solution? And what does that do to the ways you approach solving the maze? And what happens when you stack multiple mazes on top of each other and you have like the office complex instead of the flat, one-dimensional rat maze or two-dimensional rat maze. And
I've been in that office.
I think we all have.
I think my brain just melted.
Follow the orange wall, they said.
So, I mean, there's so many different ways, and even when you're just talking about generating mazes, like randomly constructing them, there's at least 12 different algorithms you can use for that. And each has its different strengths and weaknesses and benefits and different ways to tweak it and play the what if game. And I guess that's what I love about it, is that it really is this huge field that you can do almost anything in. You can do so many different variations of these things. It's so fun to play with.
Do you accept the constraint that the mazes be like physically possible, like you could print them? Or if you're working the maze in the computer, can it be like physically impossible?
Physically impossible to
exist, like where rooms would be superimposed on each other if it were in real space.
Oh, I totally think that's fun. Like 4-dimensional mazes, for instance, where you can go forward and then move thither in the 4th dimension. And then
very, very technical term there.
And then, like, if you were to map that onto 3 dimensions, you might be standing in the same place, but you're off by just that 1/4 dimension. It's a lot of fun. And you get that in games where they have like the portals and teleporters, which can make very distant locations adjacent. So yeah, I mean, you add the 4th dimension, you could, 5, 6, 7, however many dimensions, and it really does start to become mind bending and very difficult to display. But that's part of the challenge, is trying to think how you can take this data structure and render it in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm not even sure how I would go about trying to solve a 5-dimensional maze.
Well, I wrote a little program. I called it Mazoo just because it had maze in it, but I've since discovered that it's a popular phrase in Spanish Twitter, apparently. But you do solve 4-dimensional mazes, just, top down, looking at the maze from above, kind of move around. And that's been a lot of fun. It's mazoo.jameisbuck.org is where it's hosted right now. But that was my experiment to see what does it take to navigate and display a 4-dimensional maze. That was my what if game. A lot of mazes is just playing, like, especially as I was working on this book that I wrote, I'd be researching some topic and I'd think, well, that makes me wonder about this, which I don't necessarily want to put in the book, but I'm curious about. And so then I would spend a day tinkering and writing code and come up with something that might be cool and might not be, but it was fun. And that was huge for me.
Wait. Are you saying that programming can be fun?
Programming can be so fun. I came to programming because it was fun. I guess I don't know how far back we want to go. But anyway, high school, my mom got our first computer and I had vague memories of playing with BASIC back in elementary school computer classes. And I just started playing. I just started experimenting and putting things together and making interactive fiction and, Go Fish games and whatever. And I did it because, to go back to Dungeons and Dragons, it made me feel like a wizard. Like I had this magic power and I could make the computer do stuff. It was awesome.
I think it's interesting that you bring that up because for me, I kind of have the same feeling about programming, or at least I did when I started. And sometimes it's easy to forget that and think, oh, well, I have to build something that's useful or, that fits the parameters that I'm getting from my client or my boss, instead of realizing that, yeah, I can do something that's totally pointless that just stretches my brain in a way that I find enjoyable. And that's all it has to be.
Totally. I feel like corporate culture has a tendency to destroy the sense of wonder that brought a lot of us to software development because of those deadlines. And we're constantly working towards some overarching purpose. But I mean, there's been a lot of research done about the importance of play for children and how that affects their development. And I think we forget that play is also incredibly important as adults, that it keeps us fresh and it keeps us creative and lets us, even in corporate culture, it helps us approach problem solving in new ways. It helps us think of new ways to to accomplish the task that we've been asked to do. And if we aren't staying fresh, we get stale.
Well,
we burn out.
The other thing is you gave a talk at Mountain West Ruby Conference on burnout. And I think the two are related. I still haven't had a chance to watch the talk, but one of the things that I really enjoyed when I got started with programming was the discovery process. And I found that I'm finding that again when I play with things like Elixir or iOS development with NativeScript or Swift. And it's really just, I can make this happen on the phone. Like, it doesn't have to be anything major. It's like I made this button show up, and when I tap it, it does something. And yeah, it's that sense of, wow, there's this possibility. The world has opened up larger for me because of this. And, hearkening back to the topic of burnout, I was so burned out for a while, and just finding something new to go and explore and play with. And, could it be useful? Certainly. Could I build an app that people will want to use? Yes. But for me, it was more about the process of figuring out what the possibilities were in the world, as opposed to, doing the same thing that I've always done just to get the work done.
Absolutely. I think all of us either have gone through burnout at some point or will go through burnout at some point. It seems to be part of the natural cycle of many professions, but I think software developers are prone to it in a lot of ways. And play is such an important factor of coming out of that. Like you said, back in 2015, I was coming out of some burnout myself. And one of the things I did to work through that was I wrote a short novella online, just quirky, playful, not serious, exploring not maze generation algorithms, but pathfinding algorithms, like finding ways through mazes. And it was a lot of fun, and it really got me thinking, playing the what if game and thinking about programming in ways that I hadn't in a long time. It was really valuable.
So, Jameis, mazes have a long history in human civilization, going back at least 4,000 years. Do you think you are taking advantage of some of the meditative aspects of working with mazes through your technological work with mazes?
That's an interesting point. I mean, I don't like to solve mazes with pen and paper. Like, I don't have the patience for that. That's not the part I enjoy. And so, the traditional use of a maze as a meditative tool is to follow the maze, either on paper or to actually walk the maze, like in a garden or something. But for me, the fascination is more technical, I guess, like to think of what makes this maze different than another maze, or what are some of the characteristics of this particular maze, like how many corridors are horizontal versus vertical, and what's the ratio of perpendicular intersections. And like I get into that kind of analysis, but in the same sense, it is a mindful tool, even approaching it that way, like the focus and the concentration. I think there is something to that. And not that I would say I go to it for that purpose, but I think I do get something out of it like that.
I think you did go to it for that purpose in 2015 when you burned out and decided to focus on mazes. I think, although historically, as you said, it's walking the maze, it's solving the maze, being the architect of a maze, I think can be that same meditative experience. And it seems like that's what got you through.
That could be. I won't argue it. It definitely wasn't a conscious decision. I tried a lot of things in 2015. My wife and I tried some different business ideas. I tried some new hobbies. But it's interesting to me that I did keep coming back to mazes, which have been a fascination of mine for a long time.
I am kind of curious. How did you wind up coming to mazes in the first place?
It was back in high school. My junior year, we had an Italian exchange student. His name was Stefano. And he was as into computer programming as I was. And we were in a small high school. There was no computer programming course. There was a computer science class, but it was word processing and learning how to use WordPerfect at the time. And so the teacher was pretty open-minded, and he saw that Stefano and I were really interested in programming aspect of it. And so he handed us a Turbo Pascal manual and said, go for it. And so he and I kind of made our own curricula. And one of those things was to try new things, experiment and show each other what we were doing. And I remember coming to school one day, sitting down in class, and Stefano said, hey, come here. He had me come over and look over his shoulder, and I watched as he showed me this program that generated a maze. I didn't even know you could do that, and it totally fascinated me, and he showed me the code and how it worked. And in retrospect, I can look at it and say, oh, it was a variation on the hunt and kill algorithm. And that was kind of my go-to algorithm for a long time. But that's kind of the beginning of it all. That's where I first saw a maze generated and really fell in love with it.
These maze generation algorithms, are they mainly coming from academia?
Many of them are. I mean, that's the thing. Mazes are very mathematical, like graph theory and everything. Like that is really what underpins all of mazes. Talking about graphs and connectedness and trees and things like that. So there is a lot of research going back, years and years on this. And so you've got algorithms like Aldiss-Broder and Wilson's algorithm, which comes straight out of academia because they focus on what are called minimum spanning trees, which it's a special kind of, not minimum spanning trees. Sorry. Minimum spanning trees that's what a maze is. It's a spanning tree in specifically, but uniform spanning tree. That's the word I'm looking for. The idea being that if you have a grid, you can make a huge number of different possible mazes on it, just changing which nodes in that grid are connected or not. Any of those is going to be a spanning tree because it spans the entire grid. A uniform spanning tree is going to be one that is selected uniformly from the pool of all possible spanning trees. And so as you can see, it gets very mathematical. There's been a lot of research onto these uniform spanning trees, and Wilson and Aldiss and Broder were three researchers, and they came up with algorithms for generating these uniform spanning trees. So that's an example that comes straight from academia. Others, though, come from like game development. There's an algorithm called Eller's, which was developed by a guy named Eller, and I'm sure he has an academic background, but his purpose was not researching these graphs and everything. It was just trying to find a way to generate a maze with certain properties. So there's some that are very academic, some that are more practical, but all of them have a very strong mathematical background and can be described mathematically, improved mathematically.
Do you find that helpful in translating it into code, or is that more of an impediment?
It's kind of orthogonal to that. Like it's interesting to me. I am not a mathematician, but I do enjoy some of the theory behind mazes. For me, though, it's more about play, really. Like you tell me an algorithm, and part of me is like, I wonder how that can be true. And I've gone and I've read like the paper that introduces Aldiss-Broder's algorithm, but it's tough to read. It's not something I enjoy reading. I enjoy sitting down at the computer and thinking through an algorithm and trying to implement it. And the proof really has no application at that point for me. And maybe it would for someone else. Maybe someone else would be able to optimize an algorithm because they knew how it worked mathematically, but no, that's not me.
I once found an amazing book. It seemed amazing. It was a book of algorithms inspired by nature. And best of all of the code examples were in Ruby.
Nice.
So I was super excited about this book. And then I made the mistake of reading it. The Ruby code was the worst that I've ever seen. It was not object-oriented. It was procedural. It had single character variable names. It used the wrong kind of loops. It was just like the least standard Ruby that I'd ever seen. And it made me so sad. So that kind of turned me off to a lot of the academic approaches to algorithms, because like either they're unapproachable or the code is so bad that I just don't feel right using it.
That's actually a big reason why I did my book in Ruby, because that's the language that I use most comfortably. I am familiar with the idioms. I'm familiar with best practices, so I hate that phrase. I felt a lot of pressure to do it in another language like C# or something, or C++, where, more of the gaming community, developer community is going to be using that. But I felt I would slaughter it like you're describing happened with Ruby.
Well, plus you wanted it to be fun.
Exactly. And Ruby is fun. It's totally fun. But I have gotten some pushback from other people who, saw the book and they're like, what the heck, Ruby? Why Ruby? And they walk away from it, which makes me sad. But really, I don't know. I don't know what the developer might have done in the case of the book you mentioned, Corlin. But I think just having a reviewer helps a lot.
I think the problem was that the person who wrote it was not a developer.
Oh, okay. Academia, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's a problem with the sciences. The scientists, the grad students, and the researchers, they really need programming, but that's not part of their curriculum. And so they just have to scrape up the knowledge on their own. And it's really tough to get those like industry-wide practices and idioms until you like really dedicate yourself to programming. But when programming isn't your job, it's just a really efficient way to get your job done. That's harder.
Yeah.
A for collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. Like a reviewer who was a developer could have made all the difference for that book.
Yep. I mean, even me, like where I've been coding in Ruby for 15 years, my reviewers were still invaluable to me to suggest better ways to do this, or, maybe find a clearer way to do that. And in the end, I think it came out really well, probably in a large part because, I say at the front of my book that I'm not a mathematician and I'm going to avoid math speak and proofs. And it really, I wanted to focus on the fun and how mazes can be fun. And I think that influenced a lot of how the code came together and built on itself. Because, mazes are fun. That's what it comes down to.
So let's say somebody does pick an area that they want to go play in like this. How did you go about discovering what some of these algorithms were? Did you just kind of try and make some up on your own, or was it all, I hear about this one and here's how it works and I'll go build it?
Well, for a long time, I only knew this hunt and kill algorithm, which the idea is you have a grid and you start somewhere, you just pick a starting point randomly, and then you do a random walk, which means you just choose north and you go north and then west and then north and then east and south. You just pick a random path through it until you dead end, until you can't go any other way. At that point, you switch to hunt mode and you go to the top and you hunt for a location, a cell that is adjacent to, that is not visited, but which is adjacent to a cell that is visited. And then you pick it up from there. And you just do that over and over until the whole thing is filled. So that's hunt and kill. For a long time, that's the only one I knew. And so I wanted to do an article about it back in 2010 on my blog. And so I wrote a post about hunt and kill. And as I was doing that, I did some research and I came across a site called Think Labyrinth. It's a site by Walter Polin. And he's written some software called Daedalus, which is only Windows only. So I've never actually used it, but it's pretty amazing from the description. It does everything maze wise. He's also got a few pages on there that describe maze algorithms. And he doesn't describe the implementation of them, just how they work. And so that was a good jumping off point for me to say, oh, okay, let's jump into this. Let's see if I can figure out this algorithm, binary tree or Sidewinder or Eller's algorithm or any of those. And that series of blog posts that I wrote in 2010, 2011 really were the core of me discovering all these other algorithms and playing what if, like looking at it and going, okay, how does this one work? How do I implement that? What if I do it this way? What if I do it that way? And it was a lot of fun.
I found it interesting looking through the framework that you came up with for the book of, a grid that contains cells and wires those cells together. Because, I don't know, probably about 10 years ago, I was working on a project in college, and I wound up with more or less the same structure that you had, but I had come at it with a different goal, which was to explore the concept of modeling diffusion. And it was just kind of funny how we to notice how our brains sort of gravitated to that same sort of shape, because that's kind of what you get when you think about these things.
Yeah, great minds think alike, or great grids look alike, or something.
It was interesting just to see the fundamental shapes sort of like poking through.
Well, it's interesting because when I was writing the blog posts back in 2010 and 11, like I was focused on accomplishing it a different way. Like if you read those articles, I do a lot of bit manipulation. Each cell is an integer and the connections are the bits between them. And so it was pretty low level, which lets you do it pretty efficiently in a lot of ways. But I've really found that if you model the actual cells and the connections between them, the algorithms shine through really, really well. And that made the book a lot easier. Like it made the code a lot easier to explain in the book. And it's a lot more flexible in a lot of ways.
I can see a lot of implications for using a graph database for storing the information about the cells and their connections to each other. Have you experimented with something like Neo4j for that?
Not for that. That's interesting. I've played with Neo4j a couple of times on other things. But yeah, that you've got me wondering now. Because, I mean, all a maze is, it's like we said, it's a spanning tree. And so it's just connections between cells. And you get a different maze depending on how you build or remove those connections.
Yeah. I built a rudimentary, I don't know if it qualifies as a maze. I have this IRC bot that I was trying out. It was like my playground for a long time. Her name is Alice. And one of the things built into Alice was a sort of copy of the Hunt the Grue game from the old days. So there was a series of rooms, and every room had a series of exits, and so rooms were connected to one another, and there was stuff in each of the rooms. Some of it was like for interacting with, like non-player characters that you could talk to. Some of it was items that you could just collect for the fun of it, and some of them were weapons. And some rooms were dark, and if a room was dark, there would be a chance that a Grue would be in the room. And if you didn't have a weapon, then the Grue would eat you, and the maze would reset, and you'd be assigned the cursed fruitcake. And I found that just keeping track, it was generated on the fly. So as you moved east, I would create a new room to the east and decide what its exits would be. And it was really, really complicated keeping track of like the neighbors of a given room. Had they been seen before? Like what the connecting exits would have to be. That was non-trivial. I was really surprised.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear more about how you went about that, because I described 12 algorithms in my book, but I think everyone can come at it a different way and come up with new ways of thinking about how these are built and generated. And every single one of them has different strengths and different challenges. And I love hearing about how people come up with ways to generate mazes, because it is fascinating to see how their thought process arrived at it.
I'm sure I did it in the most primitive, most naive, most expensive way possible. I was really proud of the fact, though, that Alice would generate an SVG of the map as it was explored. So from IRC, you could enter a map command, and Alice would give you the URL, and you'd go to the map, and you'd see it laid out graphically, and you could mouse over the rooms and get, like, description of its contents and everything like that, so you could kind of retrace your steps. So it was a fun exercise.
Cool. That fun is the key word for that. Like I hear that and I'm like, that would be fun. And for me, the fun would be in the developing of it more than the actual playing of it, I think.
Yeah.
But,
I think
awesome.
That's the case. I think that's definitely the case. It was a novelty for the first couple of weeks that she had that feature, and in the past year, probably no one's used the maze functionality except me, but
I wonder a little bit, Jameis, if you worry that, because I've seen people that get into some problem space like this and then they realize that somebody else has already been there and done it. Do you worry that some people are going to get into this and then go, oh, but Jameis has already done mazes, so I'm going to do something else?
I don't, because it's like saying, well, Chuck's already done programming, so I'm going to go, like there's no point.
Everybody else is breathing oxygen, so I'm
right. Because there's so, like, as I was working on this book, it struck me that there are an infinite number of ways to vary these algorithms. You can play with each one of them for days and days and days. And yeah, someone else might have played with it in similar ways, but you're going to come at it from a different perspective than someone else would. And you might think of a novel way to display the maze, or a novel way to generate it with some new feature or attribute by varying the algorithm in some way. And it's a playground. It really is. It's like, if someone's already on the monkey bars, well, go play on the swings, go run around in the bark chips for a while, and just find an area that interests you. And it doesn't matter if there's other people playing there or not.
I almost feel like the premise of that attitude, too, is the idea that it's not worth doing if you're not going to be the first and you can't, like, tack your name on it. Whereas I feel like the point of playing with this kind of thing, or whatever catches your fancy, is not so much what you bring to the field, but what the field does to your brain, and what thinking about this stuff gets you.
Absolutely. I think that's an awesome way to put it, because it is play. It's just play. And if you're doing it for recognition, it's rapidly going to stop being fun. And there's room for that. Like if you want to come up with some new maze algorithm and get it published in a journal somewhere, then go for it. But there's so much room for just playing in these for the fun of it.
I think we've just captured extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation.
Yep. I'm also wondering, you mentioned that there are infinite ways to vary these algorithms. So do you get to the point where you're like, yeah, I'm not enjoying mazes as much as I did because I've been doing it for a while, or because I don't feel like there's enough new that I haven't explored yet? And then do you move on to something else?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, after I finished my book, I kind of put mazes aside for a little while because I had been so immersed in it for like 8 months that I needed a break. And that's normal, right? Maybe it's not normal for other people, but it's normal for me. I dive really deep into something for a brief period of time, and then I come out and I want to do something else. For instance, there was a time where I was fascinated by Celtic knots, and I was reading about different algorithms for producing Celtic knots. And I wrote a prototype of a program that would generate and render Celtic knots, and got it kind of working, and then moved on to something else. And, I've played with chainmail, and I've played with, I've done knitting, and I've done wood carving, and it all kind of comes and goes for me, but it all kind of adds to who I am. And mazes are a part of that too. Like I keep coming back to mazes, and then I keep going away from them, but they're there now. They're part of my toolbox, part of my playground.
I'm curious if you've limited yourself to implementing known algorithms, or if you've ever said, I'm going to ignore the math on this, I'm going to ignore the algorithms on this, and I'm just going to try something and see where it leads me.
I have. I've done kind of a hybrid too. There have been a couple of algorithms that I've done where I've taken an existing algorithm and said, what if we did it a little differently? And I've come up with some novel ways of approaching maze generation. There's other times where, and I'm less successful at this, where I'll say, this is the kind of maze I want to end up with. How would I generate that? And like I said, I haven't been very successful at that. I guess maybe I'm not that kind of a programmer as much as expertly, what's the word? To take something that already exists and change it into something else. But both ways are fun. And I've had conversations with people.
You mentioned two different ways of exploring there. One was start with something and find out what happens if you do it. And the other was start with a goal and try to get there. And I think it's kind of inherent in play to start from what happens if I do this, as opposed to I want to get there. Where at work, you typically have a goal that you need to try to get to, and that's not nearly as much fun, and it's also not as easy, and you don't get as many cool surprises.
You're right. I think both of them have benefits, and it depends on your personality, which one you're going to gravitate to. Some people are the inventors and some people are the tinkerers, and I think I'm a tinkerer, and I find a lot of joy in digging deep into the internals of something and seeing how it works, and then saying, what if? I love playing what if. Like just in Ruby recently, I've been digging into the syntax and looking at something and saying, oh, okay, well, what if we do it this way? Like I wrote a post recently. It says, well, if statements in Ruby are actually expressions, and the condition for an if statement is an expression. So what if you put an if statement in the condition of an if statement? What is that? What happens? What does that mean? And I kind of followed that rabbit hole. That's
Don't
the
cross
kind
the
of
streams.
yeah, that's kind of what it did in my head. But that's the kind of exploration I really enjoy right now.
For some reason, I just got the idea of generating a maze based on the AST of a program. Crazy idea.
You should generate the maze based on the AST of your maze program.
Very meta.
That would be awesome. that would actually be a really cool way to think about a computer program.
Yeah, you could actually encode the entire thing as a maze.
As a maze. Yeah. See, now I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight because I'm going to be trying to think about how you would do that.
And for listeners who don't know, AST is an abstract syntax tree. It is a tree-based view of the logic of your program. it's an intermediate step between the interpreted language and compiling it down into something the machine will understand.
Yeah, and it's a data structure that you can use either to generate a compiled representation of your program or to interpret it on the fly.
And it's interesting to think about an abstract syntax tree and how you execute an AST, like interpret it by following the nodes down. It's got a lot of similarities to navigating a maze, because a maze is a tree. And anyway, got me thinking.
Good.
Don't take that code or you'll make your computer crash.
For this code review,
I'm going to see a maze with a race condition.
Nice.
Well, if you end up doing that, tweet at me, because I would love to see that.
Yeah, well, likewise. Well, I'm puzzling through like what that would mean.
I've given you food for thought and probably
You have.
the interview.
That's the thing with mazes, though, is that because trees are such a ubiquitous data structure in computer programming, like we use them everywhere, whether we think about it or not. Mazes can turn up in surprising places. Fractals, like tree-based fractals, and you can wind up with mazes that get progressively finer and finer resolution. You open a door and go into a room, and boom, there's another maze. And you have to traverse that, and boom, you find another room with another maze in it, and it just keeps going down and down. There's so many different ways to think about these.
So
you should have written your book as a choose-your-own-adventure.
Dang it, you're right.
Does have cycles, Chuck.
Volume 2.
But hey, speaking of books, I was curious, and I'm always curious when I talk to somebody who's written a book. Everything that I've ever heard suggests that writing a book is this grueling thing. I've noticed, for example, that everybody who is married and writes a book makes sure to call out how loving and supportive their spouse was. And so I'm wondering, like, what to you was so important about this that you wanted to go through that, or did you just did you not realize the implications before you started? What's this like for you?
It's like having children, right? Going into it, you hear it's going to be hard, and you hear it's a lot of work. And you hear it's great too, and so you kind of go in thinking you're prepared and you're ready, and you're just never ready for the reality. Going into it, like I said, I tried a lot of things that summer. I wrote the Basil and Fabian novella about pathfinding algorithms, and really found I enjoyed that process, and kind of remembered the maze posts that I'd written and some encouragement I'd had to turn them into a book. And I wasn't employed at the time, so I was taking a year off. And so I thought, yeah, I should have some time to write a book. And so I did. And it was a lot of work. And I'm glad I didn't have a job. My hat is off to anyone who writes a book while working and raising a family, because it was hard enough just raising a family and writing a book. But it was what I needed therapeutically at that point to rediscover what I loved about programming.
Please tell me you were inspired in part by Gödel Schoenbach by Douglas Hofstadter and how he fictionalized math and science.
I wish I could say that. That is on my bucket list to read, and I haven't read it yet.
I read it like every 10 years, and I always get something new from that book. And it was really inspirational to me to get started in this field.
Doesn't it take 10 years to read it?
No. Well, you probably could if you wanted to, but
I need to read that book. I think this is the motivation I need to actually purchase it and read it.
And I'm going to come back around to Gödel Schoenbach in my picks today, so I planted the seed.
Okay.
This is Chekhov's gun, I guess.
All right. Well, speaking of picks, should we go ahead and go to picks?
Was there anything else you wanted us to cover before we go to picks, Jameis?
I think we've covered it all pretty well. I don't think there's anything specific.
Oh, I did have one other question. What is your tech stack for generating mazes? Are you generating them graphically? And if so, what tool are you using?
Oh, in the book?
Yeah.
Well, we start by generating them in just ASCII, which works well for the rectangular grids, well enough. But then I use Chunky Ping, the library to generate ping images.
Cool.
Which is pretty fantastic. It doesn't do arcs, which I missed when I did the circle mazes, but for everything else, it's fantastic.
Awesome. I'll check that out. I've only used Gosu, so.
Yeah, Chunky Ping is, I can't recommend it enough.
Cool. All right, well, let's do some picks. Sam, what are your picks?
I think just one today. For the past couple of months, I've been on a bit of a zombie TV show and movie kick. So I've watched The Walking Dead and Z Nation, which for a sci-fi show is surprisingly good. That'd be the Sci-Fi channel, I mean. And recently watched Zombieland as well. And so they're all a lot of fun, but I think of them all, I have to give the nod to The Walking Dead. It's just this wonderful story. It is as bleak as can be. It is about the end of civilization, and it's really depressing, and people do horrible things in it. But for all of that, there were really interesting characters, and I actually somehow really enjoy it. So that's my pick for today.
Awesome. Coraline, what are your picks?
I also just have one pick today, and it's something that I stumbled across years ago and just like rediscovered, and I'm absolutely in love with it. It is a website called The Codeless Code. It is an illustrated collection of fables concerning the art and philosophy of software development. The fables are a nod to Zen koans, but not nearly as inscrutable as true Zen koans. The site was started in 2010 by a developer who goes by QI, and actually he was inspired by the koans and Gödel, Schoenbach. On average, he produces one new fable per week, and they're beautifully done and beautifully written and presented. I wanted to share one of my favorite ones, The Three Most Terrifying Words, and I'm not going to read it. I'll give you a synopsis. A developer at a monastery, everything takes place in a monastery. A developer is working on a production issue, and a senior monk approaches and looks over his shoulder and says, the three most terrifying words. And a novice later that night asks what those words are and is told possible race condition. That night, the novice has terrible nightmares, and she awakens in a featureless desert. And nearby, there's a map of the world, including its deserts. Inside one desert was a red dot, pointed to by a tiny red arrow, next to which was a tiny red writing, which read, possibly your location.
All right, Jessica, what are your picks?
I have two picks today. One is a book that I'm currently reading. It's a classic. It's called Jurgen, A Comedy of Justice by James Branch Cabell. And it was written in 1919. And it was like the source of some big scandal because it talked about sex a bit. And then the edition that I was looking at was published in the 60s, and it's classified as adult fantasy, which it's totally not what we would call adult fantasy now. But apparently, it's like set in a fantasy world with like its own pantheon, but it's not for kids. And that was apparently enough to classify it as adult fantasy back in the day. But it's just really fascinating, and it's written a long time ago, but it's super interesting in its allegories and psychological insights. So Jurgen, that's my first pick. My other pick is a video on YouTube by Vihart about the two recent tragedies in Orlando and aspects of our culture that contribute to that and make it even sadder. So that's a 13-minute video that takes me hours to process, but it's very meaningful. The end.
All right. We've got a couple of picks that I'm going to put out there. The first one, so last week I was in Oklahoma for a family reunion, and we were on a property that actually had minimal cell service, meaning that I occasionally could get a text message through. If you tried to call me, it would just tell you no. And if I tried to call out, it would tell me that I didn't have a connection that would work. And there was no internet. And so, for 3 or 4 days, I was just out there with no connection whatsoever. And I have to say that it was very, very nice. And so if you're looking for an opportunity to break up some of this burnout, having a complete change of pace to the point where you can't even do the things that you would do to, that even resemble what you normally do for work or whatever. It was really nice. And I got to spend a lot of time with my family and things like that. And so, I'm definitely just picking that where you completely disconnect. A few other things we did out there that were just fun is we went out on jet skis, and we actually, there was a small lake there, private lake. And so we just were out on the jet ski, put the kids on tubes and dragged them around the lake. And that was a lot of fun. And so just being outdoors is another pick. And then lastly, we went out, we shot shotguns and rifles. And my son, shot his BB gun. And anyway, it was just a ton of fun just getting out there and, just shooting rifles. So, and shotguns. So I'm going to pick that as well. Jameis, what are your picks?
All right, so I've got a couple of picks. One, it's the Productive app for iOS, and it has changed my life, I have to say. I've been using it for probably 9 months now, and it is exactly the way that I need to think about scheduling my day. Calendars and planners have never done anything for me. Trying to schedule when something's going to happen every day is like torture. I hate doing that. But Productive just lets me say, these are the things I need to accomplish today or each day. And specifically, it's about things you're going to do every day. It's about building habits. And some of the habits I've put in there, I have done every day without breaking the chain for like 8 months. It's been really amazing. The other pick is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, how to waste time. Kerbal Space Program is my crack. I seriously cannot stop playing this game. But it's such a great example of play as a way to learn, as a conduit for learning and discovery. It's an amazing program that lets you build your rockets and understand the science behind them and plot trajectories and everything. It's pretty incredible.
That sounds fun. All right, Jameis, if people want to see what you're up to these days, what do they do? I've
got a blog at weblog.jameisbuck.org, and I've also been writing Medium lately, and I'm on Twitter as Jameis. So, yeah, come talk to me.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap the show up. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.
All right. We'll catch everyone next week. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more. Would you like to join a conversation with the Rogues and their guests? Want to support the show? We have a forum that allows you to join the conversation and support the show at the same time. You can sign up at rubyrogues.com/parlay.